Well, from 1857 to 1914, we refer to that time as the golden age of microbiology, and a lot of stuff happened then. So once we discovered that life came from life, people started looking at other things, thinking, I wonder if there's living things in my um, alcohol, because what they were finding was as they were moving their wines from one environment to another environment, like from one city to another city, sometimes the wines would go bad. They'd become like vinegar, and it was really gross. And they're like, why is this happening? So they asked Pasteur to come along, and Pasteur realized that it wasn't um, the air that was causing the juices to turn into wines, but it was yeast that were fermenting the sugars and producing wine as or alcohol as the byproduct. But he also noticed that sometimes bacteria, when they would ferment the same juices, they would produce an acidic environment called acetic acid, or an acidic product that was very bitter. And so he came up with a process called pasteurization. And what pasteurization did was it killed off the spoilage microbes, those bacteria that we didn't want in the wines that were causing the wines to go bad. And then you could add the yeast in and produce that anaerobic environment so that the wine would come out tasty. And so this led to another theory called the germ theory of disease. They started thinking, or Pasteur and others started thinking, if these microbes, these microscopic organisms that we can't see, can change the fruit juices and the fluids that we're drinking into, either wine or into vinegar, then maybe these same types of microbes, these microscopic organisms, can cause different effects on plants and animals. Now, a lot of people didn't agree with this because, again, microbes are tiny little things. How can they actually cause disease? But in 1835, Agostino Bassi discovered that silkworm disease, and so, hold on. Silkworm disease, this is a silkworm right here, was caused by a fungal infection. And it could be passed from one worm to another worm if one worm was in the same environment as the other worm that had the fungal infection. And even if he removed the fungal infected worm from the environment and put another worm into that same environment, because the microscopic spores were there, the other worm would get the disease. So this led to other scientists coming up with ways to protect living things, especially humans. Joseph Lister is a scientist who came up with the idea of antisepsis in hospital rooms or in surgical rooms. He used this carboxylic acid spray all over the surgical room and on the patient himself. He would spray it on the different surgical utensils that they were using, so the scalpels and stuff, the blades, to keep microbes from getting into the patient as the patient was having surgery. So this was really huge because prior to this, when we didn't realize that microbes were causing disease, a lot of times people would go into surgery and they'd have about a 50% chance of surviving that surgery. You didn't have surgery just for no reasons. You didn't have your tonsils taken out unless you needed your tonsils out, or, you didn't just go in um, to have liposuction. That just wasn't a thing back then because you might die. And the reason was because they didn't clean their surgical instruments. They didn't wash their hands as often as they should. They didn't realize that one patient could give disease to another patient. They didn't understand that. And so when Lister came along and produced this carboxylic acid spray, he saved multiple lives. And so then there's this, probably one of my most favorite scientists for what he did, but not for how he did it. Edward Jenner. He is thought of by many as the father of immunology. And he was around from 1749 to 1823. So this is before we even realized that life came from life. We were still in that whole spontaneous generation environment. But what he did was a huge thing. So at the end of the 1700s, around 1796, there was a huge epidemic of smallpox just spreading through the area. And Edward Jenner was studying this disease and trying to figure out, what was going on because it was wiping out populations of individuals. But what he noticed was that if you were a milkmaid, milkmaids didn't seem to be um, able to get smallpox. So smallpox was this horrible disease killing people. And if it didn't kill you, it left you very scarred, but it killed a lot of the individuals that got infected with it. But these milkmaids weren't getting sick at all. And so he did notice that the milkmaids often got this milder disease called cowpox that lasted about, 1 or 2 weeks. And then the milkmaid was fine, and that was it. And so here are some dates just to remind you. We at this point do not have any idea that microbes are in the air. We have not figured this out yet. We have not debunked spontaneous generation. We still are assuming that sickness is coming from maybe the fact that different populations were not following God's law, or for whatever reason there was a witch in the environment, and so the entire population was being punished. So Edward Jenner decided that he was going to run an experiment. Since he noticed that these milkmaids were not getting smallpox, he decided to take his apprentice, James Phipps. So back in the 1700s, a lot of times parents who were not very rich would give their children over to these scientists or doctors to have them train on the job so that they could get the experience and actually have a better life than the parents have. And so James Phipps is Edward Jenner's apprentice, and he's a young child, and Edward decides he's going to run an experiment on him. And what Edward does is, or what Edward Jenner did was he cut James, and then he infected James with the scabs of patients sick individuals that had cowpox. And a few days later, James got sick with cowpox, which would be expected. And after a couple of weeks, James was better. And then Jenner did the second part of his experiment. Now, James has been infected with cowpox. What his hypothesis is that the infection of cowpox will protect him from a smallpox infection. So he takes the scabs and pustules from smallpox patients, and he again cuts James and infects him with smallpox. So there's two different outcomes. Either his hypothesis will be supported and James will not get sick, or his hypothesis will be debunked and James will get sick with smallpox. And Edward was like, 50-50 chance. I really believe that my hypothesis is correct. So he infects him, and thank the Lord, James survived. He never got sick. And Edward was like, I knew it. If you infect yourself with cowpox, you'll be protected from smallpox. And people laughed at him. So this is 1796. And rich individuals just thought that was the stupidest thing they could ever even hear. They made jokes about it. They wrote papers, made fun of him in the newspapers that were out. But in 1998, some of these rich individuals got scared because smallpox was coming to their area, and they took Edward Jenner's advice, and they actually infected themselves with cowpox so that they were protected from smallpox, and it worked. So initially, Jenner was laughed at, but now he is, well, obviously no longer laughed at. So he is the first person to come up with an actual vaccine that was usable to protect from smallpox. He didn't know at the time that smallpox was a virus. He didn't know what caused smallpox. He didn't know how smallpox was transmitted. He knew nothing, but he knew that if you infect yourself with cowpox, you are going to be protected from smallpox. And so this is what cowpox looks like. Very mild disease, a lot like chicken pox. You're going to have a small fever, you get some blistering, and then you get better. And here is smallpox. Smallpox was a detrimental disease, and it caused pain, suffering. Individuals that did survive often, not often, always had severe scars all over their face and torso. And I already mentioned this. He infected James Phipps, and that infection of cowpox prevented smallpox. He published his findings. He was ridiculed initially, and then people started realizing that Jenner was correct. And so here's a person who had smallpox, got over smallpox, and now has the scars, the smallpox scars. We'll stop here because we'll talk about Robert Koch next, who came up with Koch's postulates that helped us to identify specific microbes to specific diseases. See you in a few minutes.